Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for a very special conversation we're having with Sharon Burstin. I'm excited to be sitting down with her to talk about her incredible stories relative to resilience and perseverance. As a child, she was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, but what no one realized for over 40 years was that her symptoms were actually part of a bigger, more complex diagnosis. She had adult Refsum disease. Even though Sharon showed all the classic signs, it wasn't until a few years ago that she received genetic testing that she finally received the answers she has been searching for her entire life. In our conversation, Sharon will share her story, why she hopes others with retinitis pigmentosa will consider whether Refsum disease could be part of their story, and what she wishes every newly diagnosed person should know. Sharon, thanks for being here today, for your openness and sharing your story and helping others by telling your story. Let's begin with telling a little bit about your experience. As you've said before, you had all the classic signs of Refsum disease. Tell us a little about what were those? Why do you think no one connected the dots for you early on?
Okay, yeah, for sure. So from birth, I already had completely unusual feet in particular. That was the thing that was very evident when I was first born. My hands are unusual as well, but the feet in particular, my big toe was really short. My second and third toe were insanely long, like way longer than normal. And then the fourth toe and fifth toe were exactly the same length, which I think the shortened fourth toe is more classic Refsum. I think I just had Refsum on steroids or something with my feet, because the second and third toe I don't think is as classic, but they were so long. And my parents saw that at birth, as did the doctors and everything. That was very evident. And my hands as well, you can see it's easier than to show my feet. My middle fingers are really long, and my little finger and thumb are really short relative to the middle fingers. And that's also a Refsum thing. So they were the things that you could see at birth. And then quite early on in the piece, we realised I didn't have a sense of smell. And I can't really pinpoint when that came about, because I don't remember smelling stuff. My mum seems to think maybe I smelt things when I was really young, but I have no recollection of that. So I can't really identify when I lost my sense of smell. I had the RP diagnosis came when I was about 11. And at that stage, I was definitely night blind, which was what tipped us off to get tested further than just the fact that I was short-sighted. And at that stage, we established that I had RP, and I already had a slightly decreased peripheral field. So the normal field being 170 degrees, I was at 120. So that was already it was already in progress, and it was already affecting things like ball sports. I was already quite clumsy with ball sports. I'd lose track of the ball and whatever. So that was from quite young. And then as time went on, more symptoms became apparent. So I think the next symptom that became apparent was that my hearing started to go. And I had had exceptional hearing, like really sensitive hearing. And then it was just getting less and less. And I did go to many different ENTs about that. They all knew I had RP, but they didn't search beyond Usher syndrome, which they ruled out. So, so the hearing was also a sign. Then the knee started to go, and that's also a Refsum thing, that I got the most incredibly severe osteoarthritis of the knee, where I couldn't even walk anymore without excruciating pain. I couldn't sleep. I went to several orthopedic surgeons about that, because I just wanted to get a different opinion than having to get a knee replacement, because it just did not appeal to me to have to go down that road. But no one had any other option for me. I did end up having to get the knee replacement. But I went to 4 different orthopedic surgeons about that, and they were all like, can't understand why you've got such a bad knee. You've got no reason for it at your age, and you're not overweight, and you haven't had an injury. And there was no explanation. Well, there was an explanation. It was Refsum. So I think the biggest problem about not connecting the dots, which is what you asked about, is that there's just no awareness. There is no awareness of Refsum and the diverse symptoms that can manifest when you have Refsum. I mean, it's a syndrome, right? So there's lots of different things that aren't connected to each other, but there's not enough awareness. So that was where, hold on. And there was one other thing that was very evident right from the get-go. My pupils would not dilate. And that was something that the eye specialists definitely should have picked up on, because that is not what happens to RP patients. That's what happens if you've got Refsum. So the combination of the RP plus the pupils not dilating, even just that should have been warning bells.
So many symptoms, so many signs that you'd have thought one of those doctors could have picked it up. You just don't know why it is that, I guess because Refsum is so rare, whether they didn't learn about it in school or they, just didn't think about it, or maybe, I mean, you had probably been talking to them, or at least some of them about the other symptoms, or you said the ENT knew, that you had RP, but they'd only ruled out one of the syndromes associated with RP in the process.
Exactly. And the orthopedic surgeon knew I had RP. I walked in with a cane and it's on the form, like they knew. It wasn't a mystery, So yeah, it would have just taken one doctor to think outside the box, just one person along the way, which I've heard many stories of people having the experience of going to one clinician about something and them making the connection. But you just have to be lucky because there's such a lack of awareness.
Right.
So
it's so important for us to drive awareness with at least starting with the ophthalmologist, but I know you'd like to go even broader, than the ophthalmologists, because so many of, could have been picked up really early on with your feet, and the surgery that you had on your feet. That would have been way earlier in the process.
Oh, I had surgery on my feet around the time that I was diagnosed with RP.
Yeah.
And, the person I went to for the surgery of my feet did not ask me any questions like, is there anything unusual about your vision? I mean, I wasn't using a cane yet. I don't even know if we would have put RP on the form. So he didn't necessarily know I had RP, but he didn't see these feet and say, oh, alarm bells, that's a really unusual foot. He just said, oh, you were born with too many bones in those toes, not enough bones in those toes, let's just play around with it. He didn't try to work out what had caused that.
Right. Yeah, I heard that shortened fourth toe, more classic, the shortened fourth toe. No one ever, it was just a natural thing, they just said, oh, it's something genetic, nothing to worry about, something you'll just have to deal with. But, obviously it's, as a young girl, it's not something you really want to have to deal with, on your feet. So, and, later on in life, obviously too, as you have balance and other things to consider. If you, had to say something to an individual who was diagnosed with RP, what would you say to them?
Oh, I would say organise genetic testing as soon as possible, because there's lots of different inheritance patterns for RP, and there aren't many where there is something you can do something about. But if you happen to have one of those, inheritance patterns of RP where there is something you can do something about it, then you're going to want to know that as soon as possible. And so organise the genetic testing, but then the other step that you can take, which may be quicker, because sometimes it takes a little while to organise genetic testing. It's not that easy to come by. Sometimes it took me years from when I started the process of wanting to get genetic testing to actually get the test done. It's not so easy to access, but it is becoming easier. But you can get something called your phytanic acid level tested with a blood test, as you know, Kristie. So this is just a matter of getting any clinician to send you with a pathology slip to get your blood test for phytanic acid, which is the very long chain fatty acids. And I think, Kristie, you can give more detail exactly what has to go on that blood test referral. But that will tell you really without a shadow of a doubt whether you have Refsum as well, because your phytanic acid level will be extremely heightened if you have Refsum disease. Like the normal range is between 0 and 3.5. Is that right, Kristie?
I think it depends upon the different testing labs, but it could be 3.5 or up to 9, but very low.
Up to
very low.
Yeah, between 0 and less than 10, it's supposed to be. And when I went and had my first phytanic acid test, it came back at 450, which I thought was insane, considering that the range, well, on my thing, it said it had to be, between 0 and 3.5. I thought, wow, I've really, exceeded in that testing, but then apparently that's really normal for Refsum. And there are people who have it over 1,000 and even up to 2,000. What's the highest you've heard? Like really high levels, eh?
I've heard, into the threes and things when people have gone a long time, and maybe they had diets that were higher in beef or lamb or goat or dairy products or some seafoods, maybe if their diet was rich in those things, that they got to really, really higher levels before they got their diagnosis. So,
yeah. Yeah. So by the time I had my first blood test for phytanic acid, I had already cut out meat and dairy from my diet. I would shudder to think what it would have been before that, because I used to have a lot of dairy, and as we know, that's a no-go zone with Refsum. So I think the fact that I did cut those things out a long time ago would have helped the level be only 450, which it's still to me, way too high, obviously. So I've now managed with the diet and lifestyle stuff to bring it down. The lowest I've gotten down to now has been 292, but I'm working hard at trying to keep bringing it down. But I don't believe I'll ever be able to get it to a normal level, but, I'm doing my best, because my understanding is that the higher the level, the more damage that's happening day in, day out.
Right, exactly. And I think it's very hard for someone with Refsum disease to get down to a normal level. I think there are some individuals that have been able to get to a normal level, but that's very rare. Normally, it's somewhere, I think they try to manage people down to the 200, 300 range.
If someone were to go to their ophthalmologist and say, because I even said to my ophthalmologist when I got my diagnosis, I said, every time you diagnose someone with RP, you have to send them for a phytanic acid test. He said, I don't know how to do that. And so I think that that's a very important piece of information to share with the clinicians is, if they suspect Refsum, or, whether it be that someone's been diagnosed with RP or whether it be an ENT that gets a patient with some hearing loss who also has RP, or whether it be an orthopedic surgeon that meets with a patient that has RP, any of these people could send you for a blood test, but they all need to know how to do that. So I think that's your category, Kristie, to give that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that often I've had that same experience of my own. I've gone to a new doctor just recently because I've moved, and they didn't think they could order one. I'm like, no, you can order one. Let me show you, and it's just part of a panel. So it's kind of hidden in the panel. And I think doctors just need to know that it's part of either what's called a long chain fatty acid panel or a peroxisomal panel. It's generally that panel can be done for some other rare diseases like in the leukodystrophy space. So I think, they just need to know to order that panel, and that panel will give them the phytanic acid level that's needed.
Yeah.
And that's generally at a much lower cost than doing genetic testing. So when, I know there's patients that might not want to do genetic testing because the cost is so high. So at least if, as you say, at least if the ophthalmologist or other specialist ordered a phytanic acid level, at least they could rule out Refsum disease, and be able to, if it is heightened, then pursue genetic testing, because then that there's more likelihood that there's Refsum disease at play. There are some other diseases that have heightened phytanic acid levels, but Refsum normally is the one that has the highest levels. Other diseases are normally heightened, but not as high as Refsum disease. So, all right, well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about you relative to the emotional impact of getting this diagnosis. How did it impact you?
Yeah. It's a good question. Look, it was definitely a relief to have an answer. It was also very empowering to have a form of RP where there is something proactive I can do, where I can take a little bit of control over my own health and try and bring the symptoms down or keep them at bay, or, stop them progressing, or however you want to phrase it. But there was also a lot of anger that I hadn't been diagnosed sooner, because I've got very little vision left. I started that journey at 120 degrees of peripheral vision, and now I'm down to 5 degrees, and one eye doesn't even have that. One eye really can't see at all anymore. I've got a little bit of central vision in one eye, and even the central vision is compromised. And the thing that upsets me almost more than the fact that I've lost all this vision is that, and now my hearing is going as well. And, I also have some peripheral neuropathy, which is another symptom where I've got poor balance and some tingling in my hands and feet. And so there's lots of symptoms. And the knee, oh my gosh, the knee. The knee was a nightmare. A knee replacement's not a fun surgery. And I had a really hard time with it. So there were lots of things that were quite distressing. But the other thing that really upset me was that I really tried to take control of my health earlier than getting the Refsum diagnosis. Like, I decided back in 1997 that I switched up my whole life and decided to just if I try to stay as healthy as I can, maybe I won't be feeding this disease of my eyes and I can hang on to my vision. So I basically revamped my entire eating plan and went on a diet of superfoods. So I thought, if I'm not feeding myself things like sugar and fried foods and alcohol and caffeine and just things that I thought were not good for you, then maybe I can just stay as healthy as I can and keep my vision. And I was very dedicated, honestly, so disciplined. And the problem was that I did my own research about what superfoods and also what are the most recommended foods for people with RP. And two foods in particular that make me very upset, that they say oily fish like salmon and sardines is really good for the omegas. So I didn't even like them, but I taught myself to eat them, and I was eating them like 3 times a week. I was having salmon or sardines, either, a piece of salmon or a sandwich with salmon or sardines, and I'd disguise it with a whole lot of avocado and whatever just to try to get rid of the taste. But I was forcing myself to eat it because I thought this is good for me, and it was terrible for me, and it's very upsetting. And then the other one is kale. Me and kale. What can I say about kale? I read all these articles about the benefits of kale because it's the highest in lutein and zeaxanthin, and it's so good for people with RP. So every time I felt like my vision was getting worse, I would just find more ways to incorporate kale into my diet. So I was putting it in stir fries and in soups, and I was juicing it, and I was making these salads with it. I was doing bunch loads of kale and broccoli, the superfoods of the green vegetable family. And, they're the two vegetables that are so not recommended for Refsum. Kale in particular is on the completely stop list. Broccoli's on the caution list. And I was having mountains of both of them. And when I said to my metabolic doctor, I said, it's not fair. I was eating kale, and he said, there's nothing fair about Refsum. You'd be better off having a can of Fanta than a bunch of kale, which to me is it's just ludicrous. So now here I am eating sugar again, and and this is better for me than kale. What the hell? Anyway, that's my shtick on the whole kale thing. So so there was a bit of anger in there. Even my GP, when I told her all of this, she actually had tears in her eyes. She said, Sharon, it's not fair. I've never met anyone more dedicated to their health than you. And for the fact that what you were doing, which was so generally considered healthy, to have been bad for you, it's not fair. So there was a fair bit of anger around that.
Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, I similar was, eating healthy, doing lots of exercise, doing all sorts of things that were good for me, but a lot of it turned out to be not so good for me.
Correct.
I think, it's hard to take that, dose that, and when I did get my RP diagnosis, I did exactly what you did. I went and I looked what was good foods because I'm very much a nutrition person. And salmon, I don't even like fish. I don't like any
Yeah.
seafood. And
Yeah.
was on the list, and I said, okay, I told my husband, I said, start cooking me some fish. He was like, whoa, because I never eat any fish. And he started
Yeah.
cooking me, that a couple times a week. And then I get my Refsum. Fortunately, I had genetic testing right at the same time. I got my RP diagnosis. So I got my diagnosis sooner or faster.
Yeah.
And so I was able to stop the salmon, faster
Yeah.
than you were able to do that. But little did I know that I was actually doing something worse for me, than better.
I know. And this is the thing, like my salmon meal would be like salmon with a side of broccoli and kale. Like that was my plate of food. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm such a champion. I'm eating
Yeah.
so well here. And it was so terrible. And it's not, but look, I think the benefit of when I did go down that health conscious road in 1997 was that I did also cut out meat and dairy because the person I was speaking to at the time said, look, you're best off just eating foods that are really easy to digest. Meat is quite hard to digest, and dairy is not really good for many people. And actually, it was something that it was hard for me to give up dairy because I love it, but I did feel much better once I did the full dairy detox, which was quite involved. I had real sinus issues. I was like, there was a real detox phase, but I must say I do feel better not having to. I used to get lots of earaches and I used to have an upset tummy all the time. And I just thought that was normal. And definitely, I most definitely do feel better for having cut out the dairy. And it's lucky that I did. So it wasn't a complete waste that I went all, health conscious. But I was, doing those things long before it was the cool thing to do. Like people weren't even thinking about dairy and sugar and whatever in 1997. And now it's just commonplace, So I'm just ahead of my time. What can I say? I'm a trendsetter. So,
Yeah, which was fortunate. I also didn't like red meats. I didn't eat a lot of high fat dairy. I did like cheese. I gotta say, I do miss cheese, but
yeah,
other than that, I didn't, and I didn't like fish. So I was lucky when I was diagnosed, my level was fairly low, like yours. It was 501, and I've been able to get mine to, in the 300 range in general,
yeah,
as well, from just going on the diet. We haven't really talked about the diet at all, but and why it's
yeah,
so important for early diagnosis. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that now. The key about the diet is to avoid, red meats, so beef, lamb, goat, dairy products, and some seafood. And it is an adjustment, as you say, both of us were fairly adjusted, but there's quite a few people, in our community we know it's not as easy.
I've got to say, the thing that was also really good about the road I went down in 1997 was that I was used to living on a restricted diet already, but it was a self-imposed restricted diet, but it already had given me the discipline of knowing that I can't just walk into a restaurant and just get whatever I want. I'm used to
Mm.
having just not a mainstream diet. So, um, when I did get the table and, the Dare Foundation has put together this amazing, easy to follow chart, which has got, your section of green with the foods you can have unlimited quantities, your amber section, which is for the caution of having only 100 grams a day, and then the red section, which is the don't have it all. And they're some of the ones that you've named there. But, I think if seeing that table would have been my first exposure to having a restricted diet, I would have struggled much more with my diagnosis because it would have been not only all the emotions that went with the diagnosis, but also having to suddenly have a restricted diet from a mainstream diet. And I'd already been dealing with that for a couple of decades. So I am thankful for that because I do think a lot of people struggle with having a restricted diet. Nowadays, it's so much easier than it was back then. I mean, we've talked about it as well, Kristie, that like how good that now you can go most pizza places and get a vegan, get vegan cheese on your pizza. And that was not a thing back then. So,
And
I can still get
dairy-free ice cream. Don't forget the dairy-free ice cream.
ice cream. Gosh, yes, when you were in Australia. So, Kristie, yeah, when you were in Australia, you discovered the best ice cream place here. And then I went there. Oh my gosh.
Yes,
Yeah.
very.
We were trying to work out how to get it 3 hours, like, that it wouldn't melt. But we just, Yeah, we didn't buy tubs of it, but at the time, oh my gosh, it was so delicious. So yeah, but there's all these options now that weren't around. And now that I'm not avoiding sugar, I can have dairy-free ice cream, even if it's full of sugar, which is crazy. My friends still can't get used to the fact that I'm eating sugar again because, they were so in awe of me cutting sugar out. And I'm like, yeah, it's apparently not bad for me. So, for me, I still wouldn't recommend it as a general dietary advice, to have mountains of sugar, but whatever, I've got to eat something, right?
Yeah, no doubt. I think we have to have a few vices in life,
Yeah, yeah.
and we already live on some pretty strict requirements. So I think having an ice cream every once in a while is not a bad thing. So
Not a bad thing. But I think the other thing that's very important to put in this conversation now, Kristie, is that it's not just the diet that's important. And I think this was something that this is what took me longer to get used to. And you mentioned before about exercise. And I had incorporated exercise very strongly into my lifestyle as well, because I thought, the more good food and exercise I do, the better. But there is that element of not over exercising with Refsum, and the importance of eating before you exercise, which is the opposite of what I was doing. I was always, doing some exercise, then eating, because I'd been told, it's good to get your metabolism going before you eat and then eat. But that's the opposite for Refsum, because of the importance of not actually burning fat, because then your body starts producing its own phytanic acid. So that was also a very big adjustment, was the actual lifestyle advice that's very important with Refsum, which is, making sure you eat very regularly. Again, that was not what I was doing. I was eating a really big breakfast, and then I wasn't eating much during the day, just a snack here and there, and then dinner. Because again, I was trying to intuitively listen to my body and just eat when I was hungry, because I feel like we all just eat out of habit. And I'm trying to do everything I can to just do all the right things. And again, that was not good for Refsum, because it's important to eat before you get hungry, because once you've gotten to the point of hungry, you might start burning fat, and that's not good with Refsum. So there was all this lifestyle stuff that went against what intuitively had become what felt right for me with regards to exercise and food and the actual food. And that was all really quite a big adjustment.
yeah, I think we've talked about that before, and that was one of the biggest adjustments for me as well. I was an athlete, doing, a ton, 16, 17 hours of exercise a week. I'd actually started a low carbohydrate diet, which is another strict diet, because I had migraine headaches. And that was actually probably the worst diet I could have ever gone on, because it's a primarily fat burning diet, and there's a lot, and I even did intermittent fasting and fasting for days at a time, just because all those things are said to be good for you as well, in some degree. And
Yep.
those are all horrible things for me to do. And so, managing those metabolic stressors, even, I think people, that have Refsum have challenges relative to weight, as well, right? In making sure that if they need to lose some weight, that they don't lose weight too quickly.
There you go. That's another thing. I was, look, this was before I was health conscious, but as a, late teen, early 20s, I was went on a roller coaster of dieting. I don't think it's an uncommon thing to do, but I went on stupid diets to lose weight quickly if I'd, put on some weight. And again, like you say, that's terrible with Refsum. There were so many lifestyle things along the way. There was a day where I used to fast. It was for religious purposes, that there was a day where you would fast once a year. And I always felt so unwell, but I did it because my family believed in it. And they just thought, oh, poor Sharon, she can't fast very well. Like, whatever, just thought I was complaining. I just don't like to not have my food or whatever. But actually really stressed my body out. And, I certainly wouldn't have done that fasting if I'd have known. And the other thing, of course, with the fasting is surgery, which is also extremely important for people to understand if they've got Refsum, if you're having a surgery or if you're unwell and you're not eating properly. There are definite protocols that you have to follow to not exacerbate your Refsum symptoms alongside whatever surgery or illness that you have. I've had illnesses, the twice that I've had COVID, both times I've lost my appetite. which I don't often lose my appetite, but I have. And, one of my kids has been like, come on, Mum, you can eat, you can eat. I'm like, I can't eat. You have to eat, Mum, you have to eat. Come on, I'm going to watch you. I'm going to cheer you on. You're going to eat. He's so gorgeous. He's been really supportive, but like, it's hard to force yourself to eat when you don't feel like it. And especially, if you've got any sort of nausea, which I've always had after a surgery from the anaesthetic, the importance of understanding all the protocols that go with Refsum. So it's really just not just the food, it's all those extra things around exercise, dieting, fasting, surgery, illness. These are all, I think there's lots of videos on the DARE website for all these different things. I think there's one for the surgical protocol. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, on the website. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not stuff we need to go over here, but that's really important for someone if they've got a Refsum diagnosis to understand right from the get-go. It took me a little while after I got my Refsum diagnosis to get on top of that stuff.
Yeah. Any other tips for someone who's newly diagnosed, Sharon?
Speak to Kristie. I think that was so helpful for me when I was first diagnosed. You reached out on that Refsum Friends Facebook group. Join the Refsum Friends Facebook group. It's worthwhile. There's definitely tidbits of information on there, but it's also very supportive. And when I introduced myself and put my diagnosis on there and what my symptoms were, you reached out to me and we had a chat, and that it just helped me. It just helped me just get my head around some of the aspects of it. But then in my own time, I sort of went through all the different videos. And even going through the videos, I think I was still a little bit in denial. I was still having my big breakfast and not eating that much during the day. And I just it was a little bit of a process of letting go of all the things that felt intuitively right for my body and really completely redefine what I should be doing. It was a bit of a process. So I think just accept that you do have to do those things, like try and do it really quickly. The sooner you do all the lifestyle stuff and the diet, the better off you're going to be. I think that the biggest challenge for me now is that stress isn't good for Refsum. And to me, that's a little bit, I mean, I'm losing my vision, I'm losing my hearing. I've got all these challenges. That is stressful in itself, let alone just life in general. So I think finding ways to manage stress is also extremely important. I can take my own advice here. And what else would I say is really important? I mean, be kind to yourself. Eat dairy-free ice cream. So
it might de-stress you a little to have
exactly. Just
cream,
enjoy it.
You
enjoy it.
Pleasures,
What have I forgotten there, Kristie? I'm sure you've got some other tidbits of what would be important.
I think you've covered most things. I think it is. I mean, one of the reasons I said to you, hey, maybe we'll connect via a chat is because I think it is nice to be able to connect with somebody that has the disease, is living with it, understands the different aspects of it, that you can reach out to as you have questions. And so that's why we're there to help support. And we do have country ambassadors. I know you became a country ambassador for Global DARE Foundation, and you've connected with others. We even actually just had a nice get together at your home right in Melbourne.
Yep.
So that was very
That was unusual to have 4 people with Refsum in one room. I mean, considering it affects 1 in a million people, we did pretty well to put 4 people together. And then you had another one in Sydney also with 4 people. Well, 2 of you were in common, but still, it's, that's like, I reckon there wouldn't be many others in Australia, that's for sure, that have been diagnosed. But I think it's underdiagnosed. It is underdiagnosed for sure.
Yeah, no, and I think the more that we do some raising awareness, and part of my travels, obviously to Melbourne and Sydney and other countries, was to raise awareness with different organizations. We were fortunate to meet up with the Center of Eye Research, which was great. They're obviously interested in helping us advance the awareness out there. They did an article on you and everything to try to get the word out. So that's great.
And not only the article, but what was very reassuring was when we spoke to the head of the School of Optometry, who incidentally was one of my optometrists like 30 years ago. And he was very reassuring that it's now a bigger part of the curriculum. It's being taught more in more detail, and it's a bigger component in the actual curriculum, so that hopefully the new clinicians coming through will have greater awareness.
Yeah, exactly. I remember it was him talking about that he wasn't trained in Refsum disease in school at all when he went through. So nice to know that he's
Yeah,
making sure it's not that it's corrected for the future. So that's great.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. But
yeah,
it's not just the like we just mentioned before. That's great that all the new eye specialists coming through will have greater awareness, but there's more to it, right? The ENTs need greater awareness. The orthopedic surgeons need greater awareness. Even heart and kidneys can be affected when your levels get really high, so cardiologists need to know, nephrologists need to know, all the different specialists need to actually have greater awareness. It just needs to be absolutely at the forefront of any clinician's mind, doesn't matter what field they're in, because there are so many fields that can be affected by, even a physiotherapist should have greater awareness about it. Like, I've got balance issues and tingling in my hands and feet. I've spoken to physiotherapists about that. I do Pilates, I'd been doing Pilates already before I got the Refsum diagnosis, but they knew about my vision, so there's so many different people that could have picked it up if it was just somehow at the forefront of people's minds. So this is it. This is why I just am. Anyone I talk to, I'm telling them everything about it, because maybe they'll talk to someone who will talk to someone, and people will get a diagnosis earlier because of it.
right. Yeah, you never know. I mean, that's every time I go to a different clinician, I bring my business card for Global Dare, or I bring a postcard that talks about Refsum disease, just because the more people we educate, the better. And I think that eventually I don't know whether we'll get all clinicians to know around the world, about Refsum disease, but we can at least continue to chip away at those, and make sure
Yeah,
so that we can get people diagnosed earlier, because that
yeah.
that in itself will make a difference.
Oh,
Even if Global Dare Foundation doesn't find a cure for Refsum disease, which we want to be doing that as well, right? And in parallel to raising awareness. But even if
yeah.
we didn't get to that, just getting people, if we could get newborns diagnosed with Refsum disease, that would be great. Like, we know someone who was diagnosed at birth and he has no symptoms. So that would be really great if we could get that earlier diagnosis, and the sooner the better. So
I actually bumped into someone who I haven't seen in years. Not for any reason, we just hadn't crossed paths, but someone I really enjoy chatting to. And anyway, she said to me, how are you going? What's new? And I said, oh, you wouldn't believe what's new, because she knew I already had some challenges years ago, just with the vision and whatever. And I said, oh, there's so much more to it. And she said, oh, tell me. And she said, do you have anger about that? And I said, so much anger. And she said, what do you do with that anger? I said, you know what? I'm actually channeling it into raising awareness, because I've got nothing productive to do with it for myself. Like, there's no point in just wallowing in anger. But there's a lot of energy in that anger. Like, and I think that if I can just raise awareness that it will give someone else an early diagnosis. Honestly, my whole life trajectory would have been completely different with an early diagnosis. For sure, it would have been. There's so much I was doing that was not good for Refsum.
yeah.
And, and they're relatively easy fixes. Like, they're not, I mean, they're annoying,
Mhm.
and they're unintuitive, and they're not necessarily what I'd want to be doing, but they're not that hard once you get used to them. Like, they're just my lifestyle now, right? Like, it's not. Well, would you agree with that? Like, it's manageable.
Exactly. When you changed your diet before, you could have just changed it to the Refsum diet, and then you would have been
Exactly.
fine, right? Like, you already had to make an adjustment, in your diet when you were trying to do something better for your RP, right? And now,
Correct.
if you had done that for Refsum, you would even be better off. Uh,
Exactly.
and you would have been able to preserve your vision for longer, and hopefully avoid some of the other symptoms that you've been having. So
Yeah.
it makes a big difference to get an early diagnosis. So switching gears a little bit, as far as Global Dare, I know you're an ambassador and you're getting a little bit more engaged with us in what we're doing at the foundation. What would you like to see us doing in the next 3 to 5 years? If you had your,
My
list,
pick.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
if you had your list that we could attack.
It's the food testing that was done. I know that it was done and it was put on hold for other research. I think the food testing for me to get conclusive information about every food, like there were lots of foods that were tested and put into the chart, but then there are lots of individual foods that haven't been tested. I know it's the more popular foods that have been, but random vegetables that haven't been tested, I don't know, just I can't even remember. I had a list of them. I remember giving a
Have your
list.
list.
I have a list, yeah. I gave a list of foods that weren't on the chart that I would love to know conclusively one way or another whether they're actually good or not good for someone with Refsum. And I think you were telling me about the what is it, the phytol fatty esters?
Yeah, the phytol fatty esters. We're, not exactly sure how phytol fatty esters break down and whether humans can break that down into phthalic acid. And so right now we believe that there's a possibility it can. That's why we have the different levels of guidance. If someone's levels are well controlled, they can follow the level 1 guidance. If they have higher levels, they recommend, going to the level 2 guidance. Some people follow the level 2 guidance regardless, depending on their own circumstances, right?
Yeah.
I think, but we would really like to understand that conversion. If we can convert it, is it a 1-for-1 conversion? Can we give better guidance? We're always looking to see how we can improve the dietary guidance, test more foods, understand this component of the actual phytol fatty esters as well and its conversion. So we are restarting the food testing program, this in 2025. We're already going back to the list that we've collected, which you had a good number of foods there, and then and starting that up again. And we're also looking to research the phytol fatty ester conversion in mice. When they eat something that has high phytol fatty esters, do they have a raised level of phthalic acid? That will give us an understanding of whether it's potentially, increases in humans. Obviously, mice and man aren't always the same, but, they're usually a good indication.
That's definitely what I would find very beneficial. Just talking about the diet, I follow the level 2. I think it also, even though my levels are relatively good for someone with Refsum, because my vision loss is so advanced, I just don't feel like I'm not comfortable just following level 1. I just feel like whatever I can do to minimize my levels is important because I just absolutely have to hang on to this last little bit of vision that I have. I just feel like there is such an enormous difference between a small level of vision or no vision at all. Like if both my eyes were the same and it was according to my bad eye, I'd be in a very different level of independence category than what I am. I mean, I'm still quite dependent in a lot of ways, but there are still quite a few things I can do very comfortably and independently when it's familiar places and it's daytime and, whatever. And I really need to hang on to that vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why both levels of guidance are there, so that we don't ignore the potential of that implication. But then people can decide if their levels are low and their condition is in a spot where they think that that's fine, they can follow the level 1 guidance, obviously using their recommendations from their clinicians and dietitians. That's why there's the 2 level of guidance. But we hope to have more data to support the phytol fatty esters in the future, which would be beneficial.
I know that you were asking that question to lots of people on your travels recently. What other things were people saying that they would like to see have happen?
Yeah, so I think one of the areas is around the exercise question. We have some general guidance around what's the best ways to exercise, but we don't have specific guidance. Like we don't know exactly, what types of exercise might be more prone to have higher releases of phthalic acid or might be more fat.
Okay.
Could we actually do some studies to understand that better? Like is walking better? Is, like higher impact exercise better? Because maybe that burns more carbohydrates versus fat. Like there's more that we can understand about and give more specific guidance to people with Refsum disease versus
that would be great.
More general guidance. So that was one of the areas. Another was on plasmapheresis or lipid apheresis and when to use that. Because in some countries, they use the diet and plasmapheresis or lipid apheresis on a regular basis. And in other countries, they only use plasmapheresis or lipid apheresis when levels are way way higher.
Yes.
And so it varies from country to country and even within countries. And so there's not a lot of information and data gathered about the use of plasmapheresis or lipid apheresis. Even just the two of those are different. And so there's a need for more information about that, especially for people that are experiencing that on a regular basis. I've never had it myself. I don't think you've ever had it, but there are people in our community that are having it regularly.
When I heard about that, the first time I went to meet with my metabolic doctor, I thought that's what I was going to be doing. I thought, oh, that's what you do. And then you bring your level down and then you just keep it down. But he's like, no, no, no. There's a lot involved in having that done and there are dangers in it. Like, so you don't just go and do it when you're at low levels. Like there can be complicated. I mean, it's got its place, but it's only when you're at dangerously high levels. If your heart is affected or your kidneys are affected, I think they're the times when or I think one person, their peripheral neuropathy got so bad they couldn't stand properly anymore. They were so weakened, so they needed it. But there are different cases. But yeah, no, my doctors were definitely not even contemplating it with me. And, I am pleased that from the time that I was first diagnosed, the first time I went to meet with a metabolic doctor, I literally had pages and pages of questions to ask. And I was so stressed about the appointment and, oh my goodness, I've got to remember to ask this, this, and this. And I've got to speak to the nutritionist about this, this, and this. And now I just go in there and it's like, oh, we don't really have anything we can tell you. You know everything there is to know. You're on top of it. You could probably teach other people about it. It's a journey to get to that point, but that's it. That's what I'm saying is that once you do get your head around it, it is manageable. It's manageable. This is it. And that's why it's so important to get that early diagnosis, because if you do manage it and you make it your lifestyle, you might just have a really normal life. I mean, you're having a pretty normal life. You were diagnosed so close to when you got your RP diagnosis. Your vision loss is minimal. It's amazing.
Yeah. And there's a lot we don't know about Refsum disease. We don't know whether, in my case, because our ages are fairly similar.
Yeah.
Why didn't I present in my teenage years or 20s with the disease? Are there different severity levels? I didn't like red meats or dairy products because it was on a lower fetanic acid diet, but you were on probably a lower fetanic acid diet for a while, even though you did have some fattier fishes and things like that. Why is there so many different variables at play? And so we need to learn a little bit more about the genetics. Are there more severe variants than others? One of the things that came up in some of our discussions with others was, why can't some people get their levels down? Like, why are some people's levels always really high? And there is an alternate pathway to process fetanic acid, which is a small pathway. I was akin, the normal pathway is like a 4-lane highway, and the pathway we have is like a 1-lane. So, can we expand
Right.
that 1-lane highway to do more? Well, in some cases, are people taking certain drugs or eating certain foods or doing something that shrinks the ability to process fetanic acid through that alternate pathway? We just don't know enough.
Right.
Like, we need to do more research on that pathway to see, can we actually use that pathway more, and could we take a drug? Could we take a vitamin? Could we take a particular food, to expand that pathway? Of course, a food that's compliant, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
something that would allow us to do more. So some of those areas, I think, whatever ways we can keep our levels low, keep the circulating fetanic acid at a low level, understand the disease better so we can manage it better. Obviously, we would like a cure, and we'll definitely be moving towards those things. But what I really heard is like, how do I manage it better today?
That's the other thing that I would love the DARE Foundation to research more strongly is the anti-inflammatory aspect, because my metabolic doctor is adamant on me not using any anti-inflammatories. And that's probably why I had such a hard time recovering from the knee replacement, because that would have been really handy to get the inflammation levels down.
Yeah.
So, I know you said that there was one case where there was some link with ibuprofen. More information about different drugs, especially anti-inflammatories, would be like concrete evidence about whether or not it's okay, would be extremely helpful as well.
I think the reason why your doctor is saying that is because the pathway that we do have to process fetanic acid is the pathway is used to process drugs. So
Right.
the idea is maybe that an anti-inflammatory could actually reduce the oxidation through that pathway and reduce your ability to process photonic acid. The more we can understand that pathway, I think that would
Yeah.
help us understand if there are any drugs, but not just anti-inflammatories, are there any
Yeah.
drugs that are actually reducing the use of that pathway? Because that would be really important for us to know. And
Completely.
I mean, it could be other things that could reduce that pathway too, or there could also be things that could allow you to do process more things through that pathway. So that to me is a really interesting area of research for us to be able to really dive into. We've got a working group set up around that, and so I'm
Yeah.
excited to move things forward there. We will have to raise some more money to fund that research, but at least
Yeah.
we've got people talking about it and coming up with avenues but to potentially submit grants for to be able to actually to dive into that research further because we can't
Yeah.
actually use the mouse model, the omega oxidation pathway. It's not the same between mice and man, so we need to find a different model to test that, maybe a cell model or a different type of model to test that pathway. So that's
Yeah.
another piece of it that we have to figure out. But that's definitely an area it's high on the priority list.
You're becoming quite a scientist in amongst it all, aren't you? Like, it's the
Yeah, a
whole
banker
scientific
turned
thing.
scientist, you know?
Yeah. 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 Just
Yeah.
another one of your hats that you can wear. So,
Right. Exactly. Well,
yeah. Yeah.
to help close this out, Sharon, if you had to say, one thing, what would you want people to take away from hearing your story?
I think the most important thing is with RP or any inherited retinal disease, really, if you are diagnosed with an inherited retinal disease, find a way to get genetic testing. It is absolutely imperative. And I know you're saying just a quick closing statement, but I do want to say that, you know, there's the Refsum Friends Facebook group, which has just got, what, 100 and something people. It's very supportive. There are RP support groups on Facebook, which have got tens of thousands of people on there. And invariably, every day, someone will say, what can I be doing? And invariably, there'll be hundreds of people saying, there's nothing you can do. Just forget it. There's nothing you can do. And I just really want to change. And I try and answer these questions, but there's only so many times I can answer the same question. But it is absolutely imperative to get genetic testing because there might be something you can do. There is, and even if there isn't something yet, if you're on the radar of, your clinician, when something evolves for your particular inheritance pattern, you'll be the first to know about it. And it is exceptionally worthwhile if you really don't want to get genetic testing for whatever reason, and that's reasonable. At least get the photonic acid test, because if you do have Refsum, there is so much you can do to slow down the progression, and that's what it's about. I mean, even if there's no cure, slowing down the progression. If you've still got some vision and some hearing, you want to keep it. So yeah, that would be my absolute. That's the imperative. What about you? Would you agree with
Yeah.
that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, that's how genetic testing is how I got my diagnosis as well. I had gotten RP and did not get the Refsum diagnosis. I'd still be on a low carbohydrate diet today if I didn't know about my Refsum diet, because that was actually working really well for me. And
Right.
so I think it's really important to get that genetic testing.
So then the one other thing that I would say is that if you have RP and you've got other random things about yourself that you've never had an explanation to, put those symptoms into WebMD or ChatGPT or all these different ways of finding things out, and it'll tell you something. Like when I now in retrospect put, you know, RP, hearing loss, no sense of smell, unusual hands effect. Like I can't remember exactly how my son typed it all into WebMD. It actually said Refsum. It told me I had Refsum before any, like not before, like I only did it after I got my diagnosis, but it knew, and it would have known before all my doctors knew. So use those tools as well. They're accessible and easy to use, and you can just get a little bit of insight into what might be going on with your body. So, there are syndromes out there that really have got completely unrelated symptoms, but that mean something. Yeah, like you've done it through. We did it through WebMD.
Yeah,
Chat.
ChatGPT, some of the AI that's coming out is just amazing on how you can actually put those things in there and you'll be able to get back Refsum disease or other diseases. AI is going to come a long way in helping doctors and us, better understand what's going on. So
Yeah, yeah,
you got to use AI properly, but I think it's definitely a way of the future. Thanks, Sharon, for sharing your story and being really open and honest with us about your journey through retinitis pigmentosa, getting your diagnosis, and how you've had to manage through Refsum disease. And thank you for your advocacy. It takes a lot to not only be diagnosed with something like Refsum disease, but then also to advocate it and help others. I really appreciate it. I've had the fortunate pleasure of meeting you in person, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristie. Well, just without a shadow of a doubt, you're my inspiration on all of it. So thank you.
Thank you.